Hi everyone, this is Mr. Fokowski for another rousing session of AP Unit 1, Chapter 3 Review. Okay, so as we've been talking about in class, we've been talking about federalism, in which you have a sharing as well as a dividing of power between the national and state governments. So how this is set up really depends on the country. We have a confederate system, which was once done under the Articles of Confederation, in which power was in the hands of mainly the states. The states dictated everything, and you had a very, very weak central government. And that makes sense because they just went through a traumatic situation with a very strong national government, in this case being Great Britain. So that's why they sort of flipped it, where more power is in the states as opposed to the national government. There's also something called the unitary system of federalism, in which power is concentrated in the hands mainly of the national government. Good examples of this would be China and Great Britain. And then we have the federal system, which divides power between the central and the states. And a good example of this is, of course, the United States. Our federal system is what makes democracy work. And one good thing about federalism is that it decentralizes our policies and also allows for more opportunities to participate. Just to put this in perspective, there's more than 87,000 types of governments, or 87,000 governments if you include our national government, state governments, local governments, school districts. All those are comprised of the federal system, so people can actually participate. It also allows for states to enact their own policies. Under the 10th Amendment, remember, states have reserved power, so they have their domain in marriage laws and education policies. So states can experiment with one another with different policies and whatnot. So, for example, if Massachusetts wants to try out universal health care just in their state, they can. And if it works well for Massachusetts, other states might adopt that. Or if it works out really well for Massachusetts, the national government will adopt it. And we sort of saw that under the Affordable Care Act. The national government does have specific powers, and we call these specific powers delegated and enumerated powers. So these powers, an example would be that Congress has the right to declare war. It also has the right to regulate interstate commerce, the power to tax. So powers that are specifically given to the national government are called delegated or enumerated powers. For the state government, they have what are called reserved powers. So again, they can regulate drinking ages, speed limits, marriages, voting requirements, and whatnot. And the basis for this is the 10th Amendment. And then there are powers that both the national and the state governments share. So, for example, taxing. In New Jersey, you pay taxes. The national government, you pay taxes. Both have their own court systems, so these are concurrent powers. And then you also have something that's called prohibited powers. These are either denied to the national or state governments, or actually both. So, for example, an example of prohibited powers would be that the state or national government cannot suspend habeas corpus. You have a right to due process. You have the right to be heard. You have the right to a trial and an impartial jury, as we know from the Bill of Rights. Moving on now, the power of the national government has significantly expanded over time, while the opposite has happened with the states. The state power has significantly weakened. So, for example, the Supremacy Clause, it basically says that the national law trumps all state laws thanks to the Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and national law will always trump state law. Big problem, like we've talked about in class, California or Colorado being a better example, legalizing recreational use of marijuana. The problem is it's against the law nationally. It's against federal law, so you have a conflict there. Technically speaking, national law is in the right. So anyone still using marijuana in Colorado is technically violating federal law. But the Supremacy Clause increases the power of the national government. We also have something called the Elastic Clause, which comes out of McCulloch v. Maryland. And it basically says that Congress can do anything that's necessary and proper. It's called the elastic because they're sort of stretching the Constitution out a little bit. Even though it doesn't directly state this, it's implied. Again, these are implied powers. So when Maryland, in this case, tried to tax the national bank, which was owned by the federal government, the national government would have to pay a tax. And the Supreme Court rules ultimately that this would have given more power to the states over the national government. And it says, no, that's not your domain. Having a national bank is necessary and proper, and therefore the states cannot tax it, even though the national bank at this point was in Maryland. So again, the big thing that comes out of McCulloch v. Maryland, Congress can do anything that's necessary and proper. With respect to the Commerce Clause, Gibbons v. Ogden, that's what comes out of there. The national government can only regulate interstate commerce, not intrastate. That's the state's domains, but anything that really, any goods or services that go outside one state into another, that is now the national government's realm. So anything like airplanes, for example, regulated by the national government. TV, radio, those airwaves go outside the state boundaries, so that falls under the Commerce Clause. So the national government can regulate it. It's been used to almost regulate everything, or almost everything. There was one exception in 1995, and this was under the case U.S. v. Lopez right here. And that was when the court ruled that Congress exceeded its authority when it banned possessions of guns within 1,000 feet of any school. And that makes sense because having the possession of a weapon really has nothing to do with commerce. So if it doesn't deal specifically with commerce, it shouldn't pertain to the Commerce Clause. But undoubtedly, the Commerce Clause has increased the amount of power the national government has. And then last but not least, Civil War. States cannot secede. This was demonstrated that the federal government is supreme. States are not allowed to nullify laws. They're not allowed to leave the Union. And again, this all just goes to show how the power of the national government has grown over time. So be familiar with these four main points. But states do retain some rights, as we see through the 10th Amendment. So again, any powers not specifically given to the national government that are not implied either are automatically reserved by the state governments. States also have obligations to one another in federalism. So for example, the full faith and credit is one obligation that they have for each other. So for example, it requires states to respect each other's public acts, records, court proceedings, and marriage licenses and birth certificates. One problem with this obviously is gay marriage, as some states have it illegal, some states have legalized it. So that's been an issue within the courts that they have to settle as well. Excuse me, another obligation that states have to each other, privileges and immunities. So citizens are afforded the same rights and privileges no matter the state. So New York can't say, oh, New Jersey drivers have to pay 10% extra on tolls. Can't do that. Everyone has to be treated the same. And then extradition. If you commit a crime in California, but you live in New Jersey, California could request, once you get arrested in New Jersey, that you have to bring that person back to California to face trial. Moving on now, federalism takes two forms in the United States. The first form it took up until the 1930s, something called dual federalism, in which the national and the state government remain separate but supreme in their own sphere. So there's no crossover, there's no really working with each other. It's similar to a layer cake, and I put a question mark here because I don't really eat cakes, so I don't really know. But I imagine like a cake that's layered. You have the vanilla being the national government, the chocolate being the state, and they really don't mix at all. But this ends in the 1930s thanks to FDR. The Republicans had like this. And now it's moved toward a trend of cooperative federalism. That's where the national and state governments share powers and responsibilities such as costs. So think of a marble cake where you see chocolate and vanilla running through each other. Liberals and Democrats tend to like this a little bit more because the national government is more involved, especially with respect to civil rights. So cooperative federalism is what we are seeing today, much more than dual federalism, where the national and the state governments are now working together. In terms of intergovernmental relations today, fiscal federalism plays a major role. Again, remember, federal and state governments are working together. When we talk about fiscal, think about money. So this is the pattern of spending, taxing, and providing grants in the federal system. It's undoubtedly the cornerstone of the relationship. Grants have expanded drastically over the past 5 years. Hundreds of billions of dollars are given from the national government down to the state and local governments. So we have a grant system of distributing money. There are two main ways of doing that. The first one being categorical grants. And think about like a specific category. They're used for a specific purpose. But there are always strings attached. So for example, states might have to match the amount of funds that the federal government is providing, or they might have to do something else that the federal government requires. Typically they're based on merit. So this might be like a project grant. So if the national government's giving money for new bridges, well, you have to show that you have a lot of rivers and that you have a need for bridges. Otherwise, you're not going to get the grant. So it has to be used for a specific project. Or there's formula grants in which amount of money depends on a formula. So if it's an educational grant, states with more population like New Jersey are going to get more money compared to a state like North Dakota with fewer kids. And then a second type of grant we have is called block grants. And these are basically financial support for broad programs. There typically are no strings attached. It just says, okay, use this money for education, and there's no mandate whatsoever. Congress doesn't like this so much because they have less control, so they're going to be naturally more reluctant to provide these grants. But states, in turn, really do love block grants. I mean, think about it. States always are looking for more money, and even if it's a categorical grant, they'll comply, although they probably don't want to as much. But if it's a block grant, even better. Now, sometimes with these the grants, we have mandates that basically a rule telling states what they must do to comply with federal guidelines. And this is, again, typically tied with grants, although not always. And in some cases, mandates don't even have anything to do with the federal aid. It could be something unrelated. There's also something called unfunded mandates. A good example of an unfunded mandate would be the Americans with Disabilities Act that required states to adjust facilities to make them more accessible to handicapped people. But there was no money given. So that was a problem. So states had to basically revamp a lot of public buildings to make them accessible. It cost a lot of money, but the national government didn't provide any money. So that's an example of an unfunded mandate. This can come from acts of Congress, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, or courts could basically rule in a court case, for example, saying that, well, the prisons need more reform and they need to be less crowded, so you have to build more space. So courts can also make mandates as well. And, evaluating federalism, there are advantages. Interest groups collectively cannot easily take over the government in most cases. What's also nice is that there's a diversity of policies among states. So this encourages states to experiment, like I mentioned earlier, with like healthcare, like Massachusetts did. So if it works there, you could try to expand it to other places. And then federalism also avoids the one-size-fits-all model. So, where something might work better in Texas and not necessarily New Jersey, that's good because, again, states can do their own thing within their realm. And also provides multiple levels for a citizen to be heard. So if they aren't heard by their local official, then they can move up to the state officials and the national officials. So there's multiple layers. And again, there's multiple avenues to participate as well. Now, there are disadvantages because the various levels can be confusing if you're not really familiar with the government. And unfortunately, a lot of Americans are not familiar. And another disadvantage includes small motivated groups can sometimes block the will of the majority. So, some people say that the NRA is too powerful and it blocks the will of the majority for stricter gun laws. Also, it can be confusing with the diversity of policies between states. So, for example, where Pennsylvania might have a law for getting your permit at 15 and a half and New Jersey's 16, it can confuse people relatively easily because, again, laws do vary depending on where you are. And again, confusion, as we've said. Different policies, different rules, so that can definitely be problematic for some people. And the last thing I'm going to mention is this trend of devolution. The movement actually started with Reagan, where you're transferring a lot more responsibility for policies from the federal government down to the local government. So states have begun to take a little bit more control. But one thing that has slowed down devolution, for example, September 11th, the need to guard against other attacks. So we've seen the federal government actually gain more power and take more of a role. We saw this with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Another example was Hurricane Katrina, where it was shown that really the states could not help everyone because they were limited in their resources. So we saw that the federal government needs to step up a little bit more. So we've seen a trend away from devolution since early 2001 with September 11th, and then followed by Hurricane Katrina. But again, just to show you federalism in a nutshell, this graph says it all. The fact that you have 87,576 governments from states, counties, municipalities, towns, school districts, special districts, that says a lot. It really says a lot how federalism is dispersing the power into many subunits of government. Okay, so hopefully you've got a good, concise review of Chapter 3. Be sure to review all notes, lectures, videos, and all that good stuff, and you'll be okay for the Unit 1 exam. All right, thank you.